All right, here's the video for the second part of our psychology of language or psycholinguistics topic. So topic 9, we're going to start this first chunk of it on language and thought. In other words, the relation of language to our higher level sort of cognitive thinking. You could think of this as a debate that's actually gone back a long time. It goes all the way back to Plato. But the question philosophers and when linguistics became a topic, question linguistics have asked for a long time is, does language affect the way we think? And you could think of this question as having kind of, if someone gives an affirmative, a yes answer, there's two kind of ways they could be giving a yes answer. A strong yes would be sometimes called linguistic determinism. And that's the idea that language determines the way we think, that if you speak a certain language, then you can't think certain thoughts, or you're forced to think a certain way based on the language you've learned or grown up with, as opposed to a weaker form of that hypothesis would be sort of that language influences the way we think, in some way shapes or has an effect on, but maybe doesn't fully determine. So the original version of this, the most well-known version of this hypothesis, is called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And the hypothesis, based on the name of a couple of researchers, Benjamin Whorf and I forget Sapir's first name, but these researchers basically argued that language shapes our thoughts. And when they say our thoughts, they mean not just our linguistic thoughts, but shapes our cognitions in general, including our perceptions, like what we see, what we experience. And that it, in essence, constrains our interpretation of reality, of our experiences. So these two researchers who it was named after, in different writings, they formulated this in different ways, sometimes stronger, sometimes weaker. So they didn't necessarily, neither of them really made that distinction of the strong linguistic determinism or strong linguistic relativity, where language really determines what we think, versus weak. They didn't really make that strong versus weak distinction, but modern psycholinguists definitely distinguish that. So we'll just start with the more kind of general, vague version, which is language in some way shapes our thoughts and perceptions. That's the hypothesis. So to give you a feel of what we're talking about, here's a quote from Benjamin Whorf. "We dissect nature along lines laid down by our native languages. The categories and types that we isolate from the world of phenomena, we do not find there because they stare every observer in the face. On the contrary, the world is presented in a kaleidoscopic flux of impressions which has to be organized by our minds. And this means largely by the linguistic systems in our minds." So really, this is the kind of thing we talked about earlier in topic 3 on the perception stuff. The idea that when we come out into the world as newborn babies, we look around and we just get this flux of crazy just colors, like a kaleidoscopic set of colors and shapes and lines. But we don't see things like balls and doors and chairs and objects out of that. It actually takes time for the brain to organize. As an active process, the brain has to start to organize that flux of impressions, right? Like he's saying here, organized by our minds, organize it together, and it takes time before we start to see that as shapes, as particular things and objects throughout the world. Same kind of thing here. He's arguing that the linguistic system is part of what does that for us, and so it has some effect on our basic understanding or experience of the world. So I want to start you off with some empirical support for this Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, some arguments why we think, based on cognitive psychology research, that at least the weak form of this hypothesis seems to be true. So let's start with some examples where language, the language you happen to speak, affects memory, and then we'll talk about some examples where language affects perception, and then we'll get into some further examples of how language affects sort of concepts or conceptualization in general. So starting with how language affects memory, one of the oldest kind of classic studies here what the researchers did is they showed people a picture. So they'd show them a series of pictures, right? A bunch of trials. But for each trial, they would show them a picture. And the participants were basically going to be reconstructing that picture from memory. Well, in one condition, the figure was given a certain verbal label. Like this one here at the top might be called a bottle. This one here might be called crescent moon. And this one here might be called eyeglasses. But there was a different set of subjects who would see the exact same picture, the exact same visual, and yet a different verbal label to it, like stirrup, letter C, or dumbbells. Then, here's where it got interesting, is they asked those participants to recreate the drawing from memory after some time had passed. And what we found is people tend to produce different figures, like even though they saw the exact same thing, they produce something different when they go to draw it out. And so it suggests that their brain was storing this not just as the visual that it was presented as, but that it got reinterpreted under that verbal, that linguistic interpretation, so that when they go back and try and access their memory actually fills in the blanks based on that linguistic interpretation. So that same picture could be interpreted as a stirrup or a bottle, and they draw it with elements that weren't there in the original picture, showing that even our visual memory seems to be influenced by this completely separate process of a verbal label. So if you call it a letter C, they draw it more like a letter C. If you call it a crescent moon, they draw it more like a crescent moon, even though it was the same shape. So in this case, that was some early evidence that once a linguistic label or category puts this on this categorizing onto a figure as one thing or another, your visual memory of what you saw may be actually altered. A more famous example, and this is a really well-known study that has some implications for even like the criminal justice system today, is research by Elizabeth Loftus, who was at the University of Washington at the time. And so this is, I've highlighted this in orange up top, so this is one of those studies I will want you to know for the exam. One of the studies you need to know at least the basics of what's the procedure, like what's the method they did, what's the results that they found, and why is it interesting. In this case, what Loftus and her colleague did was showed participants some clips of car accidents. So just really brief, short clips where some car accidents would happen. And of course, they randomized the order of these being shown. After each clip, they asked the participants what had happened. Basically, like, pretend you're an eyewitness, that you had just seen this happen in front of you. Describe to me what happened. And here's where they manipulated something as an independent variable. They changed one word that was used in a question they asked. So they asked the question, about how fast were the cars going when they blank each other, and they filled in, for different participants, they filled in one of these 5 words. So smashed or collided or bumped or hit or contacted. Otherwise, so participants saw the same thing. They were just freely describing what they saw. No differences there. And then this slight wording difference in just this follow-up question about how fast the cars were going. So the dependent variable is the speed estimate. It's the miles per hour estimate of how fast the people thought the cars were going. But in this case, when the question was asked in a way that you might consider more leading, like smashed, or less leading, like hit, contacted, something like that. So here's the results of their original study, the first experiment in the study. So this is the estimated speed. Here's the speed in miles per hour, depending on how that question was asked. So if they asked it as how fast were the cars going when they contacted each other, people estimated it was a little over 30. But if they were asked how fast they were going when they smashed each other, people estimated it was a little over 40. So the argument there from that first experiment in this study, the argument was that the participants' memory of the car speed, so what they remembered about that scene they had just briefly seen as eyewitnesses, their eyewitness memory of how fast the cars were going seemed to be influenced or biased by the wording that happened during that eyewitness interrogation later, right? You can see how this would have implications for the language used by police officers during interrogation might change how eyewitnesses remember events that happened. Now, there was a sort of question in this initial experiment, in these first results. There was a question of like, maybe it wasn't actually anything about their memory of the experience being changed, their memory of the car crash being changed. maybe there's a confound here. Maybe an alternative explanation for these results is just that the wording, so whether contacted, bumped, smashed, whatever, maybe that wording just biased their response. In other words, it biased them to give a higher number or a lower number rather than actually having them remember the cars traveling faster, right? Those are two different ways to interpret these results where we get these numbers. In one interpretation, participants were actually remembering the cars going faster just based on hearing smashed. In a different interpretation, though, maybe that's not right. Maybe they just give a higher number answer when asked how fast the cars were going when they smashed than they do when asked how fast the cars were going when they contacted, and it's just a change in their use of numbers rather than altering their memory. Maybe the language didn't affect their memory. So Loftus and Palmer did a follow-up. They did a second experiment in this same study. In the second experiment, they used the same basic procedure. Participants watched a little film of a car accident. And now they split people up into three different groups here. So one group was asked how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. Another group was asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed each other. And then there was a control group, 50 participants, who were asked no question at all. They just watched the film. And then after a delay, coming back 7 days later, all the participants, they didn't get to see the film again, but they were asked, you remember a week ago when you watched that film of a car accident? Can you please answer these 10 questions about it? So they go through 10 questions about the car accident, and everyone fills those out. But there was one question in there that was really important. One of the questions was, did you see any broken glass? Yes or no? And it turns out that if you were asked that earlier question about the cars going, how fast were the cars going when they smashed each other, you are much more likely to have, so significantly more likely to have seen broken glass. In other words, in your memory, people will say, yes, I remember seeing broken glass, if they were sort of primed to think of, in that initial question, primed to think using this verb smashed, and then less so in the hit and control conditions. So this is sort of a classic study. It's led to a lot of follow-up replications, and they all seem to find the same basic thing, which is the language we use, the wording we use, it does seem to actually affect our memory. And you can see how that's a way that could, potentially pretty easily influence eyewitness testimony. Elizabeth Loftus is actually famous for studies like this that call into question our everyday assumption that what we see is accurate, that people's eyewitness memory is accurate, and she argues that's not the case. So she even says, here's a quote from her: "The problem is clear. The unreliability of eyewitness identification evidence poses one of the most serious problems in the administration of criminal justice and civil litigation." So if you're interested, she has a lot of other good studies, and you can actually look up some TED Talks she's done that are pretty accessible as well. Okay, so let's move on from language and memory. Let's talk about some summary of some results from how language seems to affect our basic perceptual functions. So this is important because some people have argued in this psycholinguistics research about how language affects thought. Some of the early results were showing basically that language just affects how people think, but in things that are also sort of linguistic. But here what we're going to look at are some results suggesting that the language we speak affects very basic perceptual functions, like what colors you actually see and experience and how easily you can tell them apart and things like that. So to start you off here, we know that there are some differences in terms of how languages talk about different colors, how different languages talk about color. So there are speakers of one language in New Guinea that use a single name for what most other languages we know would call green and blue. We consider these two different colors, and we have sort of two different color labels, two different linguistic categories for these. But in this particular language, there's just one name for both of these things. They kind of get lumped together. You could think of them as sort of treated like different shades of the same color. Okay. And there are some other easy to find differences if you look at other languages, differences in color labeling. So, for example, Russian speakers use two different terms for what English speakers might classify as blue. So all these colors, for example, might be lumped into the category of blue, a single linguistic label for, say, English speakers, but in Russian, it might be classified into two different sets, two different colors, two different lumps, two different linguistic categories. And I'm going to butcher that. I don't know the pronunciation here, but Goluboy and Sini or something like that. The question then is, so we know that there are differences in terms of the language labels that are used for color, but does that language difference actually affect people's cognitive abilities at this basic level, like our ability to perceive things, like our perception of those colors? Does language affect what we perceive? So let's start with how we might test this in a simple laboratory experiment. One thing we might do is show people, say, a target color like this what we might call blue here in English, right? And then a couple of other colors that are close to it, one that is an exact match and one that is just a little bit off, okay? And so you're asked, of those bottom two squares, which one is the match? Which one is the same as the top square? So you're always just picking left or right, which one matches the sample up here at the top. So that's the task, something very simple like this. And of course, we can make this one that doesn't match, we can make it very slightly different from this one, or we can make it very different, like this could be green or red or something very obvious, right? But usually we're going to be testing things that are, it's kind of like a subtle difference, and we want to see if we find a difference for people who speak different languages. So, okay, here's our setup here, and this study was actually originally done with Russian speakers and then compared to English speakers. And again, in Russian, the kind of different shades, the different hues of blue might be classified into these two different linguistic categories. So you could say these sort of lighter shades might be Goluboy, and these darker shades might be Sini. And again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. But then they run through for different combos, so plucked out of different parts of this color space, they run through this task of just picking which is a match, which left or right, which one matches the sample up here. And so they picked two color comparisons that were about three steps apart on this little color spectrum. So for example, they might use 3 and 6 as the two colors that were involved in a given trial, or they might use 6 and 9, or 7 and 10, or 10 and 13, or 13 and 16. So two colors that come from the same category, or two colors like 7 and 10 that come from different linguistic categories. So that's the set, that's the independent variables. On some trials, they would be across categories or between categories color comparison, and in others it was within categories, same category color comparison, just telling which one is the odd one out. And what they found is, specifically for Russian speakers, and not for those of other languages, but for Russian speakers, the reaction time in tasks like this was faster when the pair of colors that we were comparing, the ability to perceive which is different from which, the reaction time is faster when that pair of colors comes from different categories, when they cross that border, than when the pair is within the same category. Then the reaction time is slowed down. So in other words, it's easier, if we go back up to this thing in the upper left here, this little scale, it's easier to perceive the difference between, say, 7 and 10 than it is between 10 and 13, or 13 and 16, or 2 and 5. So that suggests that the very perceptual process of telling what color is different from what other color, from being able to distinguish that something stands out at this basic level of simple color perception, even that seems to be influenced by the linguistic categories that you've grown up with. And those who have grown up with different categories, say who put blue as the label for all of these shades, they don't show that same pattern. Their perception doesn't change. Another example in the same kind of literature is there's a tribe in Namibia that has no word for blue, but actually has lots of different words for green. So they live in a forested area, and so they distinguish lots of different greens in their language. turns out that people from this tribe, when they're tested, are very slow. I mean, when I say that, I mean slower than those from other cultures, those with other languages. These people are slow to identify, say, a blue square when it's the odd one out among a lot of green squares. They're a lot slower than, say, English speakers to do that task. And yet they're better than English speakers if it comes to finding subtle differences of green, finding a green that is different from all the other greens that are all the same color. So this one on the right might take a little longer. This one on the right for English speakers might be a little harder, but actually it's in the upper right here. This green is a slightly different shade than all of these others, which are identical shades. So that's the kind of task that they did. You can see how they set it up on a monitor here to test people. Now, what we want to know is how does this relate to that idea of like language affecting our perception? It seems to support this idea that just having a word for blue makes a difference, makes it easier for us because we categorize that as a different linguistic category, makes it faster for us as say English speakers to perceive the difference between those two things just because we have that linguistic label. Like, we're all humans with the same eyes. We all have the same rods and cones in our eyes. We should, you would think, be able to perceive color just as quickly and distinguish two different colors just as quickly, regardless of who you are. As long as you're not colorblind or have some random mutation like that, it should be the same time. And yet reaction time is different based on language and culture. That is interesting. It suggests that the brain is, as we know, part of that process in organizing our experience, in organizing our perception. Perception is not just what hits the sensory detectors. It's not just what hits our cones in our eyes. What we perceive involves the brain doing a lot of work along the way before we actually see something or before we can actually do something with that visual information, like tell two things apart and make a distinction or a decision. So an expansion of that study done on not just people from different cultures, but coming back and just doing this on English speakers, there's an expansion of that study that used a very similar procedure of a bunch of colors that are all the same and then one odd color out, one color that stands out from all the others. And this study is by Gilbert et al., and this is another study that I'll ask you to remember for the exam. So another study where you'll need to remember kind of what they did, what they found, and why it's interesting. So in this Gilbert study, they used that method I was just talking about, where participants as quickly as possible would have to figure out where that odd color out is. In this case, they kept it pretty simple. They just wanted participants to classify as the odd square out, the one that's a different color from all the other blocks, is that square on the left half of the screen or the right half? So on this example in the upper right here, it would be left. And in this one, they'd say left. And in this one, it'd be right, because the green in the upper right here is the different color. And this one, it would be left, and so on. So that's the task they did, is participants just sitting there getting a bunch of these. And again, they wouldn't always be in the upper right or upper left. It might be in the far left here or up here or anywhere else. But the point is they're just, as quickly as possible, categorizing, like perceiving where that different color is. And they had people do a bunch of trials of this. And one of the things they manipulated, or one of the things they were looking at was whether the square they were showing, the odd square out, was showing up on the left half of the screen or the right half. While they knew that participants were fixating, they were staring in the middle of the screen so that they could control which hemisphere of the brain that visual information is going to. So remember, if participants are fixating at a little fixation point or a little target cross at the middle of the picture here, then anything in the left half of the screen is going to the right hemisphere of their brain, and anything in the right half of the screen is going to the left hemisphere of their brain because of that contralateral wiring we've talked about. So what they found, here's their results. They first looked at what about the trials when we have the odd square out in the right half of the screen, in the right visual field. So when they looked only at the trials where the odd square out was somewhere on the right, that's where the brain was finding the difference, right? Finding, oh, this doesn't match the other things. So that means this is the info that's going to the left half of the brain, the linguistic left hemisphere. And what they found was reaction time was slower. This is how many milliseconds here that it took people to answer where the odd one out was. the reaction time was slower, meaning closer to like half of a second, right? 500 milliseconds would be half of a second. So it's closer to half a second than a third of a second. When the comparison, the thing you're looking at, was within category shading. In other words, finding an odd blue out among a bunch of other blues, or an odd green out among a bunch of other greens. That would be a within category comparison. People were faster at doing those, slower at doing those within category comparisons, like this green within green, and faster for the between category, so a blue within a bunch of greens, like down here. They were slower for within category, faster for between category, when the stuff was showing up in the right visual field, when it was going to the language part of the brain. But here's where it gets interesting. When the task was happening in the left half of the visual field, for example, here in this middle one on the right, we've got the odd one out in the left half of the visual field. It's a within category comparison, a blue within other blues. Here we've got a between category comparison, right? A blue within a bunch of greens. But those ones where the target, the odd one out, was on the left, meaning it went to the right hemisphere of the brain, the non-language hemisphere of the brain, there they found no significant difference in reaction time, whether it was a blue among greens or a blue among blues or a green among greens. That didn't seem to make a difference. The target, the category, the label, right, the linguistic part of it doesn't matter when it's going to the right hemisphere, but our perception does seem to be affected for visual stuff that's coming in and hitting the left hemisphere of our brain, the linguistic part of our brain. So that's a pretty important example, a pretty important study that really cemented some of the research on how perception is affected by language. And it turns out that in this case, that difference really depends on whether it's going to the language part of the brain. So lateralization of the brain is a sort of I guess you'd say moderating variable here for the extent to which our perception is affected by language. So maybe in one half of our visual field, it's not as affected, and the other half, it's rather more affected. And finally, moving on from how language affects perception, I wanted to talk a little bit about some research on how language affects conceptualization. So there's some evidence that language influences conceptual representation of objects or actions, or how we make sense of the world in that basic conceptual way. So a lot of this research started with the observation that some languages assign grammatical gender to objects. So just for example, German assigns masculine to the word key. So the German word for key is masculine, and the Spanish, for example, has a word for key, right? But the Spanish word for key is feminine in Spanish. So here we've actually got two languages that talk about the same object, but one that gives it sort of a masculine flair and one that gives it sort of a feminine flair in a purely linguistic, grammatical gender way. So a study by Lera Boroditsky, who's a really awesome cognitive scientist, cognitive psychologist, I believe at UCSD, somewhere in California. What she did was taught native German and native Spanish speakers some object name pairs in English. So these are people who are bilingual. They were native German speakers but now speak English, or native Spanish speakers who now also speak English. And they just did this basic memory task. So we've talked about memory tasks like this where you get paired words, like Apple goes with Patrick, key goes with Megan, bridge goes with George, and so on. So this whole entire experiment was done in English. There was nothing about their original language there. They just happened to have grown up with a different language, right? One that has grammatical gender. But here we're just assigning some random noun with a random person who has a sort of male or female name. So in this experiment, what she manipulated was that the name getting paired up with a certain noun, the name was either consistent or inconsistent with that object's grammatical gender in their original native language. So again, we're using the word apple here in English, but we might know behind the scenes, apple is different in German than it is in Spanish. in terms of one of those, it's masculine, and that would be consistent with Patrick being a masculine name. And in one, it's feminine, where that would be inconsistent with Patrick being a male name. So key, for example, we saw that Spanish speakers, in Spanish, key is feminine, so that would be consistent with Megan, a feminine name. But then in German, key is masculine, and that would be inconsistent with the feminine name of Megan. So that was the test, and then they just test the dependent variable was just how good their memory was for this paired association task, for this paired memory task. So what she found was the memory performance was actually better when the English word's gender in their native language matched the gender of the name. In other words, for Spanish speakers, they would do better on this pairing. They remembered this pair of words better because key is feminine in their original language. So even though they're learning this pairing in pure English, just key Megan, key Megan, key Megan, they're able to remember that better just because key is feminine and Megan is feminine, key being feminine in their Spanish language. So that was one example. Others have extended this same research, but you could think of what that shows is something like grammatical gender. We could say maybe focuses speakers of different languages on different aspects of objects. So the way we think about objects may be influenced by the language that we happen to grow up with. It makes us think of different objects differently. So follow-up study on that same idea, building off of that, just actually ask people qualitatively to describe, just give us some adjectives in English. So again, this is people who speak both languages, so people who grew up with German but now speak English, or grew up with Spanish but now also speak English. And for these bilingual speakers, they just ask them in English, give us some adjectives for key, for the word key. And native German speakers would much more often come up with words like hard, heavy, jagged, or metal. And native Spanish speakers, for whom key is, right, in their original language, key is feminine, they're much more likely to come up with English adjectives like golden, intricate, lovely, or little. So that again, qualitatively seems to provide a little more evidence that the language you speak and its grammatical gender might be influencing how you perceive or conceptualize objects, even when you're thinking in a different language that doesn't have that grammatical gender. There are other examples, though, that don't involve grammatical gender. So, for example, English uses certain prepositions, like when we're talking about something being contained by something else, like these two examples on the right, we use the preposition in. The card goes in the envelope, or the bananas are in the bowl, right? And we use a separate preposition like on when one surface is supporting something else, like these bananas are on the table. But there are other languages that use slightly different categorizations. So Korean speakers, those who speak Korean, they actually differentiate. They have a word for what we might call tight fit, things that fit tightly, like this card and envelope fit tightly, versus things that have a sort of loose fit, like the bananas in the bowl have a loose fit, right? So just the way that they linguistically label these types of things, the way this banana relates to this bowl and the way this card relates to this envelope, the question is, does that affect how people think about those objects or actions we might do with objects? So there was a study back in 2003 where they had participants looking at some items, so looking at three objects and asking which is the odd one out, which of these objects doesn't fit of the three of them. So they had three objects and one of them just kind of, you're just asked, which do you think doesn't fit? Now remember, different languages have different ways of categorizing certain things. So on the top here in panel A, we've got how English might categorize 4 different actions. Like this person putting a teacup onto a table, putting on, or putting this Lego piece onto another Lego brick, right? Versus in English, we might say putting in would be something like sliding, if you've ever seen a VHS cassette going into its holder, you're putting it in, right? Or the apple or pear, whatever this is, going into the bowl, you're putting it in. In Korean, though, the words might be different. They might use, they have a word for putting an object onto a surface, like the teacup onto the table. But then they use this loose fit term for the apple or pear, for this fruit and the bowl. It's loose fit. And then there's this sort of tight fit, right? Putting two things together with a tight fit, they would use that word to describe both the VHS cassette going into its holder and the Lego brick going onto the other Lego brick. Those would use the same word. Instead of up here, we use the same word as when you put the teacup onto the table. So that linguistic difference in terms of how these things are talked about, the question is, does that affect how we think about those objects? And it turns out it does. It seems to. So Korean speakers classify the one that doesn't match. Remember, in this task, you're just picking the odd one out that doesn't match among three items. They tend to classify the one that doesn't match based on the tight or loose fit distinction, right? So there's like a tight fit, this is a loose fit, and this is a loose fit. So they'd say this card is the odd one out, whereas English speakers will classify the one that doesn't match based on material or shape. So the card here is on paper, right? The card and the envelope are paper, and here you've got a book where the bowl and the apple are paper. So English speakers will say these two are the same, and the odd one out is this mug with a spoon in it. There were similar results in a more recent study that used a similar task, found when people are thinking about actions. So again, we've got the way Korean labeling works versus English labeling works, that the language differences maybe affect how we think about actions themselves. So up here, this is just one example. This is one example question or one example trial from the experiment. This is from the 7th trial in the experiment, the 7th stimulus set that they've got. Again, you're just asked basically, what is the odd motion out? So of these three actions, which is the one that doesn't fit the other two? And in English, right, look down here at the bottom panel. In English, we would say number 1 and number 3 are both putting something in something else. So putting a bookmark in a book or putting a coffee cup in a trash can. Those we both call putting in something, whereas when you put on a glove, right, put a glove on your hand, that's separate. So people tend to say 2 is the odd action out among these three actions. But you give the exact same three actions, so the same pictures, the same three actions, to a Korean speaker, and they will put together 1 and 2 because those both involve a tight fit, and separate that from the action 3 because that involves a loose fit. So this seems to suggest that it's not just how we think about objects, but also how we think about actions. So the words we use in a language seem to determine, or maybe that's a strong word here, maybe I should say, seem to influence how people classify actions as being, say, similar or dissimilar. In other words, language affects not just our memory, not just our perception, but even the way we conceptualize objects and actions. And for the last bit of this video, I'm going to end it with this 10-minute video from Lera Boroditsky, that researcher I talked about earlier at UCSD. And she'll talk about some of the work she's done on these influences of language on our thinking. So we'll watch that to finish up this video.
Our first speaker will be Lera Boroditsky, who's going to be speaking on how languages we speak shape the way we think. She's from the Cognitive Science Department. Well, we'll just get started.
So I will be using only language to address you, no images. And I'll be doing that because I can. We humans have the gift of language just by making noises, hisses, and pops with our mouths while exhaling. We can send pressure waves through the air, and these pressure waves then magically create ideas in other people's minds, right? So I can say something like, imagine an ovulating zebra riding on the back of a rhinoceros while solving differential equations. And hopefully, if everything has gone well in your life so far, you've never had that thought. And now you've just had that thought for the first time just because I made those pressure waves travel through the air. Now, there's not just one language, of course, in the world. There are about 7,000 languages spoken around the world, and all the languages differ from one another in a huge variety of ways. Some languages aren't even spoken. They're sign languages. Languages differ in vocabulary and the kinds of grammatical structures they require. And there's a long-standing question, and by long-standing I mean thousands of years. Do the languages we speak shape the way we think? So Charlemagne opined on this. He said to have a second language is to have a second soul. Other people have argued the opposite. So, for example, Shakespeare has Juliet say, "Oh, what's in a name? A rose by any other name would smell as sweet." So there have been arguments on this back and forth for thousands of years, and there's been almost no evidence of any sort either way. There are lots and lots of strong opinions. For a few decades in the last century, this topic became completely taboo and unstudyable in any scientific disciplines that are concerned with mind or language. But in the last couple of decades, there's been new work, new actual empirical work reopening this question. A lot of the work actually has been done here at UCSD across departments, so folks in anthropology and psychology and cognitive science coming together to find interesting ways that language influences thinking. So let me give you, there's a broad body of work here, but let me give you some of my favorite examples. I'll start with the domain of space and navigation. And this starts with the work of John Hovland, who's here in anthropology. John noticed that there are some languages that, unlike English, which English often relies on words like left and right, so we might say it's your left leg, your right leg, move your cup to the left. There's some languages that don't use body-centered terms like this, and instead they put everything in cardinal directions, like north, south, east, and west. So you say things like, there's an ant on your southwest leg, or move your cup to the north-northeast a little bit. Now, to speak a language like this, you have to stay oriented. You have to know which direction is which, just in order to be able to speak the language properly. And speakers of languages like this, in fact, do stay oriented, and they can perform navigational feats that we used to think were beyond human ability. So we used to think, well, ants can dead reckon, but that's just because they have these reflective surfaces on their backs that measure the incident light from different celestial bodies. And birds can do it, but they have magnets in their beaks. That's why they can do it. We are biologically incapable of doing it. But in fact, it turns out humans are perfectly biologically capable of doing more than we thought we were. There are people in the world who can do it by virtue of the practice that language requires of them. And just so we can convince ourselves that we're not so great at being oriented, I'm going to ask all of you guys to close your eyes right now. So everyone close your eyes and point southeast. Okay, you can open your eyes. I see points there, 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 there. I have no idea which way it is, but I think we can say the accuracy was not 100%, right? I think that's safe. Okay, so that's a big difference in cognitive ability, where you have relatively young children in one culture that can easily point southeast, and here we have a group of distinguished professors who can't do it, right? That's a big cognitive difference. Another domain where you find big differences like this is how we think about time. So across languages, we tend to use a lot of spatial language to create time. So in English, we talk about the best ahead of us, the worst behind us. We also use our writing direction to organize time. So it might be very common for an English speaker to organize time from left to right. Of course, if you're a Hebrew or Arabic speaker, you might think that time goes from right to left. If you don't have left and right in your language and you don't use those ideas in your culture, you might actually orient time from east to west. So I've done some studies like this showing people who orient themselves in absolute space tend to orient time in absolute space as well. Time can also reverse on the front-back axis, so we think of the future as ahead of us and the past as behind us. But work by Rafael Nunez here in cognitive science shows the Aymara put the past in front of them and the future behind them. You see this pattern in the metaphors and the language, and you also see that in the way people use their bodies, the way they gesture when they're talking about the past and the future. So those are big differences. There are also pretty deep differences that languages create. Let me give you an example. Some languages don't have exact number words. Some languages have only words like one, two, and then few and many, and some don't even strictly have one and two. And not too surprisingly, speakers of languages like that don't keep track of exact numbers. They don't have algebra. They don't do any of the things that would be required to build a room like this, for example. And so that is I say that's a deep difference because a simple thing like having count words in your language opens the door to a whole lot of other transformative cognitive abilities that can really change not just the way you think, but also your material culture and the way you communicate that material culture and build on it. There are lots of other examples, the way people make even simple decisions about colors, whether or not people think bridges are masculine or feminine, whether they're strong or beautiful, depends on grammatical genders in the language. There are differences in eyewitness memory. How likely are you to remember who did what? Depends on how you're likely to describe the event. These studies suggest that each language comprises its own cognitive toolkit, a set of instructions that speakers of your language in generations past have created for you, a set of ideas and tools that have been honed and fine-tuned over generations. And some of the languages in the world may provide very similar toolkits, others will be very different. But I think what's important about this is that linguistic diversity is a real testament to the ingenuity of the human mind, right? That our minds have the exquisite capacity to create not one pass at the physical universe that we're all trying to describe, but 7,000 different passes. There's not one linguistic universe, there's 7,000 universes. And we're able to create many more. We're constantly changing our languages and fine-tuning and honing them more. Now, linguistic diversity is still vastly underexplored. We've only scratched the surface, and I think this is a perfect topic to bring together perspectives from lots and lots of domains. Obviously, expertise on language, on cognition, that exists across the university, and bringing more folks together to address this issue, I think, would be wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, so what happens if you have, I mean, I had never heard this about orienting or discussing the world in terms of left-right versus compass points. What happens to somebody who's bilingual in those two different structures?
In fact, there are lots of people who are bilingual. So a lot of these languages are in Australia, for example, and so a lot of the speakers of the languages will be bilingual in Aboriginal Australian English and in one of the native languages, and often they'll be multilingual. It's common for people to speak lots of the local languages. Well, so let me answer your question in a much more general sense. Bilinguals tend to have in their minds all of the knowledge systems from all of the languages in which they're proficient, right? So if you've had to learn something in order to speak a language, you keep that knowledge in mind. There is some shift that happens when you switch from one language to another. So you'll be thinking more like a Russian speaker when you're speaking Russian than when you're speaking English, in most cases. But there are still traces of the Russian that you've learned or the English that you've learned, regardless of which language you're in. So you have this kind of mediated influence. Does that answer your question in the general case? Yeah, so they're not at all inconsistent. So English also has a north, south, east, west system. We just don't use it nearly as much. We don't use it for small scales, so we never use it for our bodies or for tabletop space. And we also use it very inconsistently when we do use it for large spaces. So most of our highways that we say run north don't really run north, right? They might run northwest or sometimes south in terrible situations, but that does happen. So these aren't incompatible views. In some cases, there are incompatible views, like in grammatical gender. You could have something masculine in one language, feminine in the other, and in that case, what you get is some kind of in-between representation.
All right, so we'll stop there for this first part of Topic 9, Language and Thought. If you have any questions, don't forget you can ask those on the discussion board. We can continue our discussions there, and we'll move on to the next video soon.